The carriage rattled violently over the frozen, deeply rutted earth of the Yorkshire moors, every brutal jolt sending a sharp, jarring ache straight up Clara's spine. Outside the frosted glass of the hired hackney, the world was nothing but a bleak, bruised expanse of charcoal sky and dead, unforgiving heather. The wind did not merely blow across the desolate landscape. It shrieked against the thin wooden walls of the carriage, a relentless, biting cold that seeped easily through Clara's threadbare wool cloak and settled deep into the marrow of her bones. She pulled her worn leather portfolio tighter to her chest, crossing her arms as much to retain a sliver of body heat as to protect the fragile, expensive vellum safely secured inside. She squeezed her left eye shut, testing the right. The grey, creeping fog at the edge of her vision had thickened since Tuesday. A cold sweat broke out beneath her woolen bodice that had nothing to do with the freezing temperature. If the encroaching rot in her eye took her sight, it would take her life. A blind botanical illustrator was a starving one. She needed the exorbitant sum promised by this mysterious commission to afford the pioneering optical specialist in London. She needed it desperately enough to risk the Duke of Ashbourne. The Beast of Ashbourne, if the terrified, hushed whispers of the village innkeeper were to be believed. A man who had survived a catastrophic inferno only to retreat into absolute darkness, allegedly ruling his decaying, isolated estate with a violent temper and an iron fist. The carriage lurched to a sudden bone-rattling halt. Clara peered out the window, wiping away the condensation with a gloved thumb. Ashbourne Manor loomed in the descending gloom like a gargantuan rotting tooth jutting against the sky. Its dark, formidable stone walls were choked with dead, skeletal ivy, and its windows were blank, unlit eyes staring blindly into the moors. The carriage driver refused to step down from his perch, merely shouting a gruff command for her to alight. The moment her leather boots hit the frozen gravel, he snapped the reins, and the carriage took off, leaving her entirely alone in the howling, ice-tipped wind. But it was not the foreboding manor itself that drew her gaze. Sprawling out from the southern wing was a colossal structure of wrought iron and glass, a cathedral of a conservatory, its towering panes clouded with heavy condensation and pressed upon by internal overgrowth. It looked like a massive terrarium meant to house leviathans. A singular, pale, golden glow emanated from deep within its belly. With no butler emerging to greet her, and the bitter cold rapidly numbing her fingers into uselessness, Clara walked toward the colossal glass house, her heart hammering a frantic, trapped bird rhythm against her ribs. The heavy, rusted iron door took all of her meager strength to pull open. As she slipped across the threshold, she was immediately hit by a physical wall of heat. The contrast was so violent, it physically stole the breath from her lungs. Gone was the biting frost of the moors. Here, the air was stifling, incredibly heavy, and dripping with aggressive moisture. The scent was overpowering. A thick, intoxicating perfume of damp loam, crushed green leaves, rotting wood, and the sharp, spicy tang of blooming exotic orchids. Clara unclasped the heavy brass hook of her cloak, sweat instantly prickling at the nape of her neck. The sheer scale of the vegetation was monstrous. Towering tree ferns brushed the glass ceiling 30 feet above, while thick, snake-like vines of ivy and passionflower tangled aggressively around the rusted iron pillars. The glass house was a beautiful, suffocating jungle, wild and desperately overgrown. Condensation dripped like slow, rhythmic rain from the glass canopy overhead, splashing softly onto broad, waxy leaves. She stepped further into the humid labyrinth, the damp moss muffling her tentative footsteps. She kept her good eye trained on the winding, slick stone path, her portfolio gripped so tightly her knuckles ached. It was then she heard it, a soft, metallic snip, followed by the dry, papery rustle of dead leaves. She froze instantly, pressing her back against the damp, ridged bark of a massive rubber tree. Through a curtain of weeping willow branches, illuminated by the soft, pooling light of a single brass lantern resting on the earth, she saw him, the Duke of Ashbourne. He was a mountain of a man, clad in a dark, severe frock coat that stretched taut across his incredibly broad shoulders. He stood with his back partially to her, a looming silhouette that practically radiated raw, coiled hostility. The village rumours roared back to life in her ears. A monster, a madman, a beast who threw a magistrate down a flight of stairs. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced straight through the humid heat of the conservatory, freezing the blood in her veins. She dared not take a breath. But as she watched, paralysed in the humid shadows, her terror snagged on a jarring, inexplicable incongruity. The monster was not destroying anything. He was crouched slightly over a low, crumbling stone bench, his massive frame hunched in an attitude of intense, almost reverent concentration. In front of him sat a pathetic, withered, maidenhair fern, its delicate, thread-like fronds brown and curling inward at the edges. The Duke held a pair of small, silver pruning shears. He did not hack at the dying plant. Instead, his large, powerful hands moved with an agonizing, breathtaking delicacy. He cradled the fragile, dying stem with his bare fingertips, touching the plant as gently as one might hold a newborn bird. He snipped away the rot with microscopic, painstaking precision, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm of absolute focus. Clara blinked, the creeping fog in her right eye momentarily forgotten. The sheer, impossible contradiction between the man's terrifying size and the tender, heartbreaking care he took with the dying fern sent a strange, warm flicker of curiosity blooming through her chest. How could a man rumoured to be so violently unhinged possess hands capable of such profound gentleness? She leaned slightly forward to get a better look, her weight shifting on the slick moss. A small pebble snapped sharply beneath her heel. The sound was minuscule, but in the heavy, oppressive silence of the glass house, it cracked like a pistol shot. The Duke went perfectly still. The silver shears paused in mid-air. Slowly, the massive figure rose to his full, terrifying height. He turned slowly toward the shadows where Clara hid. The brass lantern caught the left side of his face, a rigid, gleaming expanse of smooth, cold white porcelain. He wore a half-mask, blindingly stark against the darkness of his raven hair and the severe cut of his clothes, hiding whatever horrors the inferno had left behind. But his right eye, dark, entirely human, and violently furious, locked onto her instantly. Clara's pulse deafened her. She clutched her portfolio to her chest, paralysed like a mouse caught under the sudden predatory gaze of a hawk. He took a single heavy step out of the shadows, the gleaming porcelain catching the light, and spoke. His voice was a low, rough rumble that vibrated through the damp earth beneath her boots. "If you are the Illustrator," the Duke commanded, his single visible eye narrowing with terrifying intensity, "then take out your charcoal. You are going to draw me a flower that does not exist." The echo of his demand hung in the humid air, heavier than the moisture beaded on the broad leaves around them. "A flower that does not exist, Your Grace?" Clara forced the words past the tight, panicked knot in her throat. Her voice wavered a fraction, a betrayal of her nerves that she immediately cursed herself for. The Duke of Ashbourne stepped fully into the pool of lantern light. The stark, white porcelain of his half-mask gleamed like polished bone, an unnatural, rigid curve covering the left side of his brow, cheek, and jaw. But it was the unmasked right side of his face that held her captive. He possessed a severe, aristocratic harshness, a sharp, slashing cheekbone, and a jawline carved from granite. His dark eye narrowed, assessing her with the cold, a predatory calculation of a wolf sizing up a trespassing doe. "Do you possess a deficiency in hearing, miss?" He trailed off, his tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. "Clara?" she replied, lifting her chin a fraction. "Clara Vance." "Miss Vance, do you possess a deficiency in hearing or simply a lack of imagination?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that seemed to resonate in the damp earth beneath her boots. The sheer arrogance of the man snapped something deep within Clara. The paralyzing terror that had gripped her only moments before receded, washed away by a sudden, sharp spike of professional pride. She gripped her leather portfolio tighter, anchoring herself. "I possess a precise understanding of botany, Your Grace," Clara fired back, her tone steadying into crisp professionalism. "I am an illustrator of science, not a painter of fairy tales. I cannot accurately render a specimen without a thorough comprehension of its taxonomy, the structure of its calyx, the arrangement of the corolla, the length of the stamen. I require anatomical facts, not riddles." A tense, suffocating silence descended over the glasshouse. A single heavy bead of condensation fell from the iron rafters 30 feet above, landing with a wet smack on a nearby palm frond. Drip. The Duke stared at her. A muscle feathered beneath the skin of his unmasked jaw. He had clearly expected her to shrink away, to avert her eyes from his porcelain visage, perhaps even to swoon from the sheer, overwhelming heat of the conservatory. He had certainly not expected a lecture on floral anatomy from a woman half his size, shivering in a threadbare cloak. Slowly, the aggressive set of his broad shoulders relaxed a fraction. The dark eye lost its murderous edge, replaced by a glint of sharp, undeniable intellect. "It belongs to the genus Selenicerius," he said suddenly, his pronunciation of the Latin flawless, rolling off his tongue with educated ease. "Though it deviates in its foliar structure. The petals are numerous, lanceolate, and entirely translucent until the precise moment of anthesis. The reproductive organs are deeply recessed, protected by a dense ring of specialized, highly toxic trichomes." Clara blinked, her mind automatically translating the complex botanical terminology. Lanceolate petals. Toxic trichomes. He wasn't mad. He was brilliant. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Beneath the monstrous reputation and the terrifying mask was a mind of razor-sharp academic precision. "Follow me," he commanded abruptly, turning on his heel. Clara did not hesitate. She unclasped her heavy wool cloak, draping it over a nearby stone bench, and followed him deeper into the labyrinth. Every step they took sank softly into a thick, spongy carpet of emerald moss that aggressively overran the winding stone paths. The air grew thicker, laced with the sudden, overwhelming perfume of night-blooming jasmine. It was a heavy, sweet, cloying scent that coated the back of Clara's throat and made her head swim, battling against the underlying stench of wet earth and rot. Above them, the constant, rhythmic drip, drip, splash of condensation falling from the vaulted glass ceiling measured their progress like a slow, weeping clock. "There are rules to your employment here, Miss Vance," the Duke stated, not bothering to look back at her as he navigated the dense foliage with practiced ease. "Rule the first. You will work only between the hours of dusk and dawn. This specific conservatory is entirely off-limits to you during the daylight hours. Do you understand? I require natural light to ensure the accuracy of my ink washes," Clara argued, hurrying to keep pace with his long, predatory strides. "You will use oil lamps," he countered smoothly, his tone brokering no argument. "Rule the second. You will not speak of what you illustrate here to anyone outside these glass walls. My research is delicate. And rule the third." He stopped so suddenly that Clara nearly collided with his broad back. He turned, towering over her. The scent of jasmine was almost suffocating now, mingled with the faint, clean smell of the medicinal soap he used. You will remain strictly within the confines of the Eastern Quadrant, where your workbench has been established, he said, leaning down so his unmasked eye was level with hers. You are not to wander. You are not to explore. And under no circumstances are you to approach the iron door at the northern terminus of this path. If you violate these terms, your commission is forfeit, and you will be cast back onto the moors before you can draw a single breath. Is that entirely clear? Clara forced herself not to flinch, holding his intense, intimidating gaze. She would not let the beast of Ashbourne see the tremor in her hands. Perfectly clear, Your Grace. He stared at her a moment longer, perhaps searching for the lie, before giving a curt, single nod. He pointed toward a clearing ahead where a sturdy oak workbench sat bathed in the warm light of several oil lamps. Begin preparing your vellum. I will return with the first set of descriptive notes. Without another word, he melted back into the heavy shadows of the ferns, disappearing as silently as a ghost. Clara let out a long, shaky exhale, her knees suddenly feeling weak. She made her way to the workbench, unpacking her charcoal, her fine-tipped dip pens, and her precious sheets of vellum. The humidity was already threatening to warp the paper. She would have to work quickly. Reaching for her small glass water pot to dilute her ink, she realized it was entirely empty. She looked around. The Duke had vanished. The rhythmic dripping of the glasshouse was her only company. She needed water, and surely there was a spigot or a rain barrel nearby. Telling herself she was merely solving a practical problem, Clara picked up the glass pot and stepped off the designated eastern path. The jasmine scent grew thicker, almost metallic in its intensity, as she pushed through a curtain of heavy, weeping vines. The temperature seemed to drop slightly here, the air growing cooler, less stifling. She walked for perhaps 20 paces, the moss muffling her footsteps until the foliage abruptly parted. Clara stopped dead. Set into the far northern wall of the glasshouse, completely hidden from the main thoroughfare, was a massive, heavily reinforced iron door. It was free of the rust that plagued the rest of the conservatory, its surface slick with dark condensation. A heavy, intricate brass padlock secured the latch. It was exactly what he had forbidden her to approach. And yet, as Clara stood trembling in the shadows, she noticed something that made the hair on her arms stand on end. The heavy, sweet scent of jasmine wasn't coming from the vines around her. It was seeping from beneath the crack of the locked, forbidden door. Clara practically fled back to the eastern quadrant, her pulse drumming a frantic, echoing rhythm in her ears. She forced herself to breathe, to push the image of the locked iron door and the cloying, suffocating scent of the jasmine from her mind. When she reached her designated workbench, she found that the Duke had kept his word, albeit invisibly. A thick sheaf of heavy, cream-coloured parchment lay resting beside her blank vellum, covered in bold, aggressive slashes of black ink. His botanical notes. She collapsed onto the wooden stool, her muscles trembling from the adrenaline and the oppressive, inescapable heat of the glasshouse. It was the middle of the night, yet the air felt as thick and warm as a woolen blanket soaked in hot water. She unbuttoned the high collar of her dress, her skin slick with condensation, and pulled her charcoal stick from her leather satchel. She had to focus. She had to secure this commission. Clara arranged the Duke's notes beside her vellum. The petals are numerous, lanceolate, and entirely translucent until the precise moment of anthesis. She closed her eyes, visualizing the structure based on his precise Latin terminology, mapping the invisible architecture of the phantom flower in her mind. Then, she brought the charcoal to the paper. Scritch. Scratch. The dry, abrasive sound of the charcoal dragging across the rough tooth of the paper was the only noise in the conservatory, save for the eternal weeping drip, drip of the condensation falling from the glass canopy. She sketched the preliminary outline of the receptacle, her hand moving with practiced, rhythmic grace. But the environment was violently fighting against her. The single brass lantern provided to her was woefully inadequate. It cast a meagre, flickering pool of golden light that barely illuminated the center of her desk. Beyond that fragile halo, the glasshouse was a sea of impenetrable, suffocating blackness. The massive, towering fronds of the tree ferns surrounding her workspace caught the weak light, casting long, eerie, jagged shadows across her paper. They looked like the skeletal fingers of some macabre beast, constantly reaching and shifting over her drawing as the lantern flame flickered in the damp drafts. And then, the grey fog began to creep in. Clara stopped drawing, her breath hitching. She squeezed her left eye shut, praying to whatever gods might listen that it was merely fatigue. But as she looked through her right eye alone, the center of her vision was swallowed by a murky, translucent, grey film. The sharp black lines of her charcoal sketch instantly blurred, swimming and dissolving into the dim lighting. Panic, cold and absolute, pierced through the humid heat of the conservatory. "Not now," she pleaded silently, her hands beginning to shake. "Please, not now." She pinched the bridge of her nose, rubbing her failing eye with the heel of her hand until she saw bursts of meaningless white light. When she opened it again, the fog remained, stubborn and terrifying. The damp heat of the room felt suddenly suffocating, pressing against her lungs. If she could not see the fine details, if she could not render the toxic trichomes the Duke had described with absolute microscopic perfection, he would dismiss her. She would be cast back out onto the moors, destitute, her remaining vision ticking away like sand in a shattered hourglass. Clara leaned forward, her spine curving painfully. She lowered her face until her nose was mere inches from the vellum, desperately trying to force her failing eye to focus on the charcoal lines through the dim light and the dancing, skeletal shadows. The strain sent a sharp, stabbing ache directly behind her brow. Scritch. Snap. She pressed too hard. The brittle stick of charcoal shattered against the paper, leaving a jagged, too ugly smear across the delicate curve of a petal. A quiet, ragged gasp escaped Clara's lips. She dropped the broken pieces of charcoal, her ink-stained fingers curling into tight fists. She was entirely alone in the suffocating dark, fighting a battle inside her own body that she was destined to lose. A single hot tear of pure frustration and overwhelming vulnerability slipped down her cheek, splashing onto the corner of the vellum. She bowed her head, hiding her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling with the effort of holding back a sob. She did not hear him approach. The thick, spongy moss swallowed the sound of his heavy boots entirely. But suddenly, the heavy, humid air within the clearing shifted. The overwhelming stench of wet loam and rotting wood was pierced by a sharp, clean scent. Sandalwood and medicinal carbolic soap. The hairs on the back of Clara's neck stood on end. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, her face still buried in her hands. She could feel the sheer physical weight of another presence standing just beyond the edge of the light. The beast of Ashbourne was there, waiting in the absolute dark. He had seen her. He had seen her straining, practically pressing her face to the paper like a blind beggar. He had seen her break her tools. He had seen her cry. Clara braced herself for the cruel, aristocratic mockery. She waited for the deep, vibrating rumble of his voice to demand she pack her things and leave his estate. She closed her eyes tight, preparing for the humiliation. But the mockery never came. Instead, a large, dark shape moved into the periphery of her vision. Clara slowly lowered her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. A massive hand, encased entirely in supple black leather, reached into the meagre halo of light. The Duke did not reach for her, nor did he touch her ruined drawing. His gloved fingers, thick and powerful, settled delicately over the small brass dial at the base of the oil lantern. With a slow, deliberate twist, he turned the dial. The wick rose. The flame flared brilliantly, driving back the darkness with a sudden, robust wave of warm, golden light. The eerie, skeletal shadows of the ferns were instantly banished to the far edges of the clearing. The vellum before her was suddenly bathed in perfect, bright clarity, the charcoal lines rendering sharp and distinct once more, cutting through the grey fog in her eye just enough to let her see. Clara sat perfectly still, entirely paralyzed by the unexpected, silent mercy of the gesture. The gloved hand withdrew just as smoothly as it had appeared, retreating back into the impenetrable wall of darkness. The Duke did not speak a single word. There was only the faint, retreating rustle of heavy wool against the damp foliage, and the subtle fading of the sandalwood scent. For a long moment, Clara could do nothing but stare at the brightly lit vellum, the sudden, brilliant light feeling like a physical lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She slowly turned her head, looking into the dense, black wall of ferns where he had stood. The conservatory was empty, save for the rhythmic dripping of the condensation. She let out a shaky exhale, reaching down to gather the broken pieces of her charcoal. As she leaned to the side, the newly brightened lantern cast a sharp light onto the moss near the base of her wooden stool. Clara's breath hitched. Resting on the damp, emerald moss was a heavy, black leather glove. It was large, the knuckles worn and shaped to the unmistakable contour of a massive hand. He had stripped it off as he retreated into the dark, leaving it behind in the shadows. Clara reached down, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The leather was still incredibly warm from the heat of his skin. She stared at the glove, her heart pounding a new, chaotic rhythm in her chest. The Duke of Ashbourne had not just happened upon her. He had been standing in the darkness, watching her work, watching her struggle. And instead of casting her out, the monster of the moors had given her the light. The heavy black leather of the Duke's glove lay atop Clara's workbench, a stark, foreign object against the delicate white vellum. Clara stared at it for a long, fractured moment, her thumb unconsciously tracing the worn crease of the knuckles. It retained the impossible, radiating heat of his skin, carrying the faint, intoxicating scent of sandalwood and something sharper, like ozone just before a thunderstorm. She had come to Ashbourne Manor expecting a beast. Instead, she had found a man who pruned dying ferns with the delicacy of a saint and left his own glove in the damp earth just to give her light. She forced herself to look away, setting the glove reverently at the corner of her desk. She could not afford the dangerous luxury of curiosity. Her right eye ached, a dull throb protesting the sudden flare of the lantern, but the grey fog had retreated just enough for her to work. Beneath the Duke's aggressively scrawled notes, Clara noticed a small, oblong bundle wrapped in damp, rough-hewn burlap. It had been pushed toward the back of the table, blending in with the shadows. Carefully, she untied the twine. The heavy fabric fell away to reveal a thick, fleshy green cutting of a cactus stem. It was a vicious-looking specimen, deeply ribbed and covered in clusters of fine, hair-like spines that shimmered with an almost iridescent, silvery menace in the lantern light. The reproductive organs are deeply recessed, protected by a dense ring of specialized, highly toxic trichomes. His words echoed in her mind. This was the Selenicereus variant. He had left her a physical reference. Clara leaned in, her professional fascination overriding her exhaustion. The structure of the aerials, the small bumps from which the spines grew, was incredibly complex. She needed to see how the protective hairs overlapped to accurately render the defensive ring around the future bloom. She picked up her small magnifying glass, squinting through it with her good eye. The spines were not merely sharp, they were hollow, like microscopic glass needles. She reached out with her left hand, intending to gently rotate the damp burlap to view the cutting from a different angle. She was careful. She was an expert. But the condensation dripping from the glass ceiling above chose that precise fraction of a second to fall. A heavy drop of water struck the back of her hand. Clara flinched. It was a movement of perhaps half an inch, but it was enough. The side of her index finger brushed against the silvery cluster of trichomes. Snap. It did not feel like a prick. It felt as though a white-hot ember had been driven directly into her flesh. Clara gasped. A sharp, ragged sound that tore through the heavy silence of the glasshouse. She jerked her hand back violently, knocking the magnifying glass onto the moss. The pain was immediate and astonishing. It was a chemical fire that raced instantly from the pad of her finger, shooting up her wrist and into her forearm like a line of liquid lead. She gripped her wrist, her breath coming in short, panicked pants. A single drop of blood welled at the puncture site, but it was disturbingly dark, almost black in the lantern light. "What have you done?" The voice was a low, vibrating crack of thunder. The Duke of Ashbourne materialized from the impenetrable wall of ferns so quickly he seemed to have stepped out of the thin air itself. He had not gone far. He had been there, lingering just beyond the light, an invisible guardian in the humid dark. He crossed the clearing in 3 massive predatory strides. All aristocratic distance, all formal boundaries, evaporated in an instant. He did not ask for permission. He seized her left hand. Clara gasped again, but this time not from the poison. Because he had lost his left glove, he grasped her with his bare hand. As his long, powerful fingers wrapped firmly around her wrist, Clara felt the violent history of the man pressed directly against her skin. His palm and the inside of his fingers were a landscape of thick, raised silver scars. The tissue was puckered and rigid, ruined by the inferno that had claimed his face, yet the heat radiating from him was absolute, vital, and incredibly human. "Foolish, stubborn woman," he ground out, though the furious baritone of his voice was laced with a sudden, raw edge of panic. He pulled her hand closer to the lantern, his unmasked eye widening as he saw the dark, weeping puncture wound. Without hesitation, he reached into the deep pocket of his frock coat and withdrew a small, corked glass vial and a crumpled linen handkerchief. "Do not move," he ordered, his chest rising and falling heavily, mere inches from her own. He unstopped the vial with his teeth. The sharp, astringent scent of camphor, crushed eucalyptus, and bitter yarrow instantly overpowered the cloying perfume of the jasmine. He tipped the dark green liquid onto the linen and pressed it brutally hard against her bleeding finger. Clara let out a whimpering hiss, her knees buckling slightly from the sudden, stinging agony. Instantly, the Duke's scarred hand shifted, sliding from her wrist to encircle her forearm, gripping her with a desperate, stabilizing strength that kept her upright. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She was close enough to see the fine, dark lashes framing his one good eye, close enough to feel the slight, ragged catch in his breathing, close enough to see the minute, terrified tremor in the hands that held her. The beast was afraid. For her. Clara looked up from her wounded hand, her gaze locking onto his unmasked face. The icy, terrifying exterior he presented to the world shattered completely in the warm, golden light of the lantern. Beneath the rigid porcelain mask, he was just a man who had been burned, who hid in the dark, and who was now holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in his overgrown kingdom. The sheer, breathtaking gentleness of his scarred fingers working the medicinal poultice into her skin, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold moors outside. "The pain will recede," he murmured, his voice dropping to a rough, intimate whisper that vibrated against her collarbone. "But the alkaloid is fast. It is already in your blood." He was right. The burning in her finger was already dulling to a numb throb. But a new, far more terrifying sensation was taking its place. A violent, rushing heat bloomed in her chest, entirely unnatural and suffocating. The heavy humidity of the glasshouse suddenly felt like the inside of a blazing furnace. Clara blinked, but the grey fog in her right eye was violently expanding, spilling over until her good eye was blinded by the same murky, swimming film. The edges of the lantern light smeared into dizzying, chaotic streaks of gold. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. The damp earth beneath her boots felt as though it were pitching like the deck of a ship. "Your Grace," Clara breathed, her voice slurring, sounding as if it were coming from at the end of a long, dark tunnel. The Duke's head snapped up, his eye wide with alarm. "Clara, look at me." She tried, but her head was entirely too heavy to hold up. The world violently tilted on its axis. The strength completely drained from her legs, her muscles turning to water. She felt herself falling, slipping down into the suffocating, humid dark. But she did not hit the ground. Before she could collapse entirely, the Duke moved. His arms, solid, unyielding, and incredibly warm, wrapped around her, catching her firmly against the broad expanse of his chest. As the fever from the poisoned thorn dragged her under into unconsciousness, Clara's cheek pressed against the fine wool of his coat, the steady, frantic beating of the beast's heart, the last thing she heard. The fever was a crucible of white-hot embers. Clara drifted on a violent tide of heat, the heavy, suffocating humidity of the glasshouse entirely replaced by an agonizing internal fire that threatened to incinerate her from the inside out. When she finally managed to pry her eyes open, the murky grey fog of the poison had thinned just enough to reveal that she was no longer in the damp, earthy labyrinth of the conservatory. She was lying on her back. Beneath her, the mattress was impossibly soft, a cloud of feather ticking. Cool, crisp linen sheets, smelling faintly of dried lavender and decades of undisturbed dust, were drawn up to her chin. The stark contrast between her sweat-slicked skin and the chill of the fabric made her shiver violently. A shadow shifted in the periphery of her blurred vision. A massive chair creaked in protest. "You are awake." It wasn't a question. The voice was a low, resonant rumble, stripped entirely of its former aristocratic disdain. It was heavy, instead, with a ragged exhaustion. Clara tried to turn her head, but it felt as though it were carved from solid lead. "Water," she rasped, her throat parched, tasting of copper and old ash. Instantly, the shadow leaned forward. The dim light of a dying hearth fire illuminated the stark white curve of his porcelain mask. The Duke of Ashbourne slid one large, powerful arm beneath her shoulders, lifting her with such effortless, startling care that she felt practically weightless. "Not water. Not yet," he murmured, his breath brushing her temple. "Drink this." He pressed a heavy silver goblet to her cracked lips. Clara took a blind swallow and immediately gagged. It was a vile, punishing concoction, a bitter onslaught of crushed wormwood, steeped willow bark, and something sharply medicinal that burned fiercely on the way down. "Swallow it, Clara," he commanded gently, the use of her Christian name slipping out with unconscious intimacy. The scarred pads of his fingers traced a slow, soothing circle against her back, coaxing her throat to work, reminding her to breathe. "The seleniserious alkaloid attacks the nervous system. The draught will bind to the toxin, but you must keep it down." She forced herself to choke down the rest of the bitter liquid. When the goblet was empty, he lowered her back against the pillows with agonizing slowness, as if terrified she might shatter upon the mattress. As the minutes bled into hours, the fever waged a brutal war inside her veins. There were moments of terrifying, teeth-chattering cold, where she curled into a tight, shivering ball. During those times, the Duke would pile heavy velvet quilts over her, his large hands tucking the edges tightly around her shoulders to trap whatever heat she had left. Then came the inferno, where she thrashed against the linen, feeling as though she were burning alive. In those moments, he would wipe a cool, damp cloth across her brow and down the delicate line of her throat. His touch lingered every time, a grounding, physical anchor in the chaotic storm of her delirium. "You must not sleep," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the haze during a particularly vicious wave of heat. "The toxin slows the heart. Keep your eyes open. Listen to me." Clara blinked, her vision swimming. He was sitting at the very edge of the mattress now, the heavy velvet drapes of the bedchamber drawn tight against the Yorkshire night. He held a small, leather-bound volume in his lap. He began to read. It was not a scientific text or a dry botanical journal. It was poetry. His voice, usually wielded as a weapon of intimidation, she transformed into an instrument of profound, hypnotic comfort. The low, vibrating cadence of his baritone wrapped around the syllables, reciting lines of melancholic, enduring love and shifting tides. "And the woodbine spices are wafted abroad, and the musk of the rose is blown." Clara let her heavy eyelids droop, though she fought desperately to stay conscious. She focused entirely on the vibration of his voice, letting the rhythm tether her to reality. The sheer, staggering irony of her situation washed over her in a wave of feverish clarity. The world outside these walls considered the Duke of Ashbourne a monster. The villagers locked their doors against the legend of the beast. Yet, lying here in the unfamiliar darkness of his decaying manor, utterly defenseless and entirely at his mercy, Clara realized a terrifying truth. She had never felt safer in her entire life. The rigid, terrifying armor he wore, the severe frock coats, the harsh commands, the gleaming porcelain mask, was all a cage of his own making, designed to keep a cruel world at bay. Beneath it was a man who tended to dying ferns, who surrendered his own glove to give her light, and who now kept vigil at her bedside, using his voice to literally keep her heart beating. The poetry washed over her, and the fever spiked again, burning away the last remnants of Clara's propriety and fear. The line between what was socially acceptable and what was pure human instinct dissolved completely in the heat. He leaned closer to check her brow, the dying embers of the hearth casting a warm reddish glow over the unmasked right side of his face. His dark eye was filled with a raw, unprotected vulnerability that he had likely never allowed another living soul to witness. He hovered over her, his breathing shallow, the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and medicinal herbs enveloping her senses. Driven by a deep, delirious need to comfort the man who had been comforting her, Clara slowly lifted her left hand from beneath the heavy velvet quilts. Her arm trembled with profound weakness, but she did not stop. She did not reach for the cold, perfect porcelain of his mask. Instead, her fingertips bypassed the rigid edge, moving to the right side of his face. With excruciating, tender slowness, Clara pressed her palm against his scarred, unmasked cheek. The ruined flesh was rigid and uneven beneath her touch, heavily puckered from the flames that had nearly consumed him. But it was incredibly warm. It was real. The Duke of Ashbourne went perfectly, utterly still, the breath completely leaving his lungs. The light was a physical assault. Clara gasped, throwing a weak arm over her eyes as a harsh, blinding beam of morning sun pierced the bedchamber. The heavy velvet drapes, which had sealed them in a cocoon of intimate darkness the night before, had been thrown violently wide. The fever that had threatened to incinerate her was entirely gone, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion, but her mind was startlingly, brutally clear. She lowered her arm, squinting into the unforgiving daylight. She was entirely alone. The vast bed was cold beside her. A silver pitcher of water and a perfectly folded stack of her own clothes rested on the mahogany nightstand. But the man who had kept vigil through the darkest hours of her life had vanished. Clara pushed herself up against the pillows, her breath catching as the memories of the night rushed over her in a suffocating wave. The bitter taste of the medicinal draught, the hypnotic, soothing rumble of his voice reading poetry. And then, the terrifying, irreversible moment her fingertips had bypassed the porcelain mask to press against the ruined, blistering heat of his cheek. She remembered the way he had gone perfectly, utterly still beneath her hand, as if a single breath would shatter them both. She looked down at her left hand. Her index finger was bound tightly in a strip of pristine white linen. The throbbing ache had dulled to a manageable twinge. He had saved her life, and she had touched his deepest, most guarded shame. Moving with slow, stiff determination, Clara washed her face with the freezing water from the pitcher and dressed in her wrinkled woolen gown. The sprawling halls of Ashbourne Manor were silent, echoing like a tomb, as she navigated her way back toward the southern wing. When she pushed open the heavy iron door of the conservatory, the contrast to the previous night was jarring. Without the softening cloak of darkness and the warm, golden pools of lantern light, the glasshouse felt violently exposed. The morning sun glared relentlessly through the vaulted glass canopy, illuminating years of accumulated grime, streaks of dried condensation, and creeping moss. The air was still thick and heavily perfumed with jasmine, but millions of dust motes danced lazily in the blinding shafts of light, suspended like falling ash in the stifling heat. The silence was absolute, heavy, and intensely awkward. She found him in the western aisle, standing before a towering, tangled wall of bougainvillea. The beast of Ashbourne was fully, immaculately armoured. He wore a stark, black frock coat, buttoned to the throat, a flawlessly tied silk cravat, and the heavy leather gloves. And there, strapped firmly to his face, was the cold, unyielding white porcelain mask. The sunlight struck the glazed surface, making it gleam like polished bone. He did not turn when her boots crunched softly on the gravel path. His broad shoulders were locked in rigid, aggressive tension. "You were instructed to remain in your chambers until the village physician arrived, Miss Vance," he said. His voice was a whip-crack of ice, stripped entirely of the low, vibrating tenderness that had tethered her to reality the night before. Clara stopped a few paces behind him, her hands trembling slightly where they were buried in the folds of her skirt. "The fever has broken, Your Grace. I am entirely well. I came to thank you." "Do not." He cut her off, the sheer violence in his tone causing her to flinch. He viciously snapped his pruning shears through a thick, woody vine. Snap. The sound echoed sharply in the damp air. "I merely protected my investment. A dead illustrator cannot complete my commission." The cruelty of the words was a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. He was retreating. He was terrified of the daylight, terrified of what she had felt in the dark. And so he was building the fortress of his monstrosity back up around himself, brick by agonizing brick. "Is that all it was?" Clara asked, but her voice quiet, but incredibly steady in the echoing silence. The Duke finally turned, towering over her. The unmasked side of his face was a mask itself, cold, aristocratic, and fiercely unreadable. The dark eye that had looked at her with such raw, unguarded panic was now a flat, fathomless black pit. "The seleniterious alkaloid induces profound delirium," he stated, his words clipped and excessively formal. He looked over her head, refusing to meet her gaze. It causes hallucinations. It strips the mind of its faculties. Whatever you believed you saw or felt or experienced during the height of the fever was a phantom of the poison. It means nothing. You will forget it entirely. He stepped forward, intending to brush past her and disappear into the labyrinth of the glass house. But Clara did not move aside. The sudden spike of her own pride and a strange, desperate kind of grief flared in her chest. She had seen the man beneath the monster, and she utterly refused to let him bury that man alive again. As he attempted to step around her, Clara moved, sidestepping quickly to block his path. He stopped short, his massive chest a mere inch from her face, his gloved hands clenching into fists at his sides. He was trapped between a heavy iron support pillar and a massive stone planter. "Step aside, Miss Vance," he warned, a dangerous, vibrating rumble returning to his chest. "No," Clara breathed, tilting her head back to meet his furious, singular gaze. The blinding morning light poured over them, trapping them in a halo of dancing dust. "I was not delirious, Julian." He recoiled as if she had struck him, the sound of his Christian name on her lips, shattering the icy facade for a fraction of a second. "I know exactly whose hand held mine in the dark," Clara continued, stepping even closer, forcing him to press his back against the damp iron pillar. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she did not break his gaze. "I know whose face I touched. You cannot hide behind the poison, and I will not let you hide behind me." She raised her trembling, bandaged hand, pointing directly at the gleaming white porcelain bisecting his face. "Take it off." The command was a fierce, breathless whisper that echoed in the bright, stifling air. Take it off in the daylight. The silence that followed her demand was absolute. A fragile, vibrating tension that stretched so tight it threatened to snap them both in half. Then the Yorkshire sky broke. With a sudden, violent crack of thunder that rattled the very iron bones of the conservatory, the blinding morning sun was swallowed by a bruised, slate-grey storm front. The rain did not fall. It plummeted, striking the vaulted glass ceiling with a deafening, relentless roar. The sudden absence of sunlight plunged the eastern quadrant into a dim, watery gloom. The Duke of Ashbourne stared down at her, his broad chest rising and falling in harsh, uneven intervals. The rain hammered above them, a chaotic percussion that mirrored the frantic beating of Clara's own heart. She did not lower her hand. She did not step back. Slowly, with the agonizing reluctance of a man stepping up to the gallows, Julian raised his gloved hands to the leather buckles hidden in his raven hair. "If you look away, Clara," he warned, his voice a low, a ragged tremor beneath the roar of the rain. "If you flinch, I will not forgive you." "I will not look away," she vowed, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the noise with absolute certainty. With a soft snick of metal, the buckle gave way. He pulled the porcelain mask free, lowering it to his side. Clara stopped breathing. The left side of his face was a landscape of profound, brutal survival. The fire had taken the smooth, aristocratic lines of his jaw and cheek and melted them into a jagged topography of raised, silvery pink scar tissue. The skin was pulled tight, webbed with the ghostly traces of the inferno's heat reaching from his left temple down into the collar of his cravat. The fire had spared his eye, but the lashes were gone, leaving his left gaze stark, unprotected, and currently blazing with a defensive pride. He was a ruin of a man. He was the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing she had ever seen. Clara did not gasp. She did not recoil. She simply looked at him, letting her good eye trace the map of his agony with nothing but quiet, profound reverence. Julian's chest hitched. He turned away sharply, unable to bear the weight of her unflinching gaze, and strode deeper into the overgrown foliage, vanishing behind a thick curtain of weeping fig. Clara immediately followed him. She found him in a hidden, sunken alcove built into the far stone wall of the glass house. It was darker here, the glass above them stained with years of wet leaves. A small, cold iron stove sat in the corner, radiating a sharp, bitter scent of old wood ash that cut through the heavy perfume of the jasmine. Julian stood with his back to her, his massive hands gripping the edge of a rusted iron potting table so tightly the leather of his gloves groaned. "The society papers claimed it was a duel," he said to the damp stone wall, his voice bitter and hollow. "A duel over the honour of a Venetian opera singer. They said I was thrown into a fireplace by a jealous husband." Clara stepped into the alcove, the smell of the old ash settling heavy in her lungs. "And the truth?" "The truth is remarkably unromantic," he rasped, bowing his head. "It was 5 years ago. A carriage lantern knocked over in the dry hay of the servants' quarters. The fire spread before the alarm could be raised. I woke to the screaming." He paused, a visible shudder racking his massive frame. The doors had swelled from the heat. They were trapped, a laundress and 2 young stable boys. I took an axe to the door, but the roof beam collapsed as I pulled the last boy out. He finally turned to face her, the mottled, scarred ruin of his cheek fully exposed in the dim, watery light. The boy lived. I burned. And the world decided that a man who looks like a monster must inherently be one. So I built these glass walls, and I became the beast they required. The sheer, staggering injustice of it brought a hot rush of tears to Clara's eyes. He had sacrificed himself to save the lowest members of his household, and society had repaid him with exile and monstrous rumours. She crossed the small alcove. He braced himself, every muscle in his body locking rigid as she approached. Clara stopped inches from him and reached out, taking his heavy, gloved hand in her small, pale one. "You hide from the light, Julian," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But the light is hiding from me." He frowned, his dark, mismatched eyes snapping to hers, the defensive anger replaced by sudden, sharp confusion. "What do you mean?" Clara swallowed hard, the confession tasting of ash on her tongue. "The commission. The exorbitant fee you offered for the Noctis Rosa. I did not come to the moors because I am brave. I came because I am desperate." She raised her free hand, lightly touching the skin beneath her right eye. "There is a fog creeping into my vision, a grey, dissolving rot. The physicians in London require a fortune to attempt a surgery that might halt it. If I cannot draw your flower, Julian, I will go entirely blind." The silence in the alcove deepened, broken only by the relentless hammering of the rain on the glass roof above. Julian stared at her, the revelation shifting the very air between them. He looked at her delicate, ink-stained fingers, at the brave, terrified set of her jaw, and slowly, the last remnants of his icy armour fell away. They were 2 broken things, hiding in the humid dark of a glasshouse. One, a man whose exterior had been ruined by fire. The other, a woman whose internal world was slowly fading to black. It was a perfectly asymmetrical tragedy. With excruciating gentleness, Julian turned his hand over, tangling his thick, leather-clad fingers with hers. He stepped closer, the heat of his massive body radiating against the damp chill of the alcove. "I will not let you fall into the dark, Clara," he vowed, a fierce, vibrating oath that resonated in his chest. "You will paint the Noctis Rosa, and I will pay whatever the surgeons require. You have my word." The emotional intimacy of the promise was a physical weight. Clara looked up at his scarred, unmasked face, her heart soaring. The physical space between them had vanished almost entirely. She could feel the erratic, heavy pull of his breath against her hair. He leaned down, his gaze dropping to her lips, the tension shifting from shared grief into a sudden, blindingly hot pull of pure desire. Crunch. The sound of heavy boots on the gravel path outside the alcove shattered the moment like a pane of dropped glass. Julian's head snapped up, his jaw clenching as he instinctively stepped between Clara and the entrance of the alcove, shielding her from view. "Your Grace!" A reedy, out-of-breath voice called out over the roar of the rain. It was Mr. Hodges, the elderly estate steward, the only servant permitted within the conservatory walls. Julian quickly snatched the porcelain mask from the potting table, strapping it back onto his face with practiced, furious speed. When he stepped out of the alcove, he was the beast of Ashbourne once more. "What is it, Hodges?" he barked. The old steward stood shivering in the main aisle, holding a silver tray. Resting upon it was a single, thick envelope made of heavy cream vellum, sealed with a massive dollop of blood-red wax. "An express rider from London, Your Grace," Hodges said, his voice trembling as he extended the tray. "He rode through the night." Julian stared at the red wax seal, the crest of the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, his estranged aunt. He picked up the letter, breaking the seal with a violent snap of his thumb. He read the sweeping script in a matter of seconds. Clara watched from the shadows of the alcove as the blood completely drained from the unmasked side of Julian's face. The paper crumpled in his massive fist. "Your Grace?" Hodges asked timidly. "Prepare the guest wing," Julian ordered, his voice suddenly hollow, a dead, echoing sound that chilled Clara to the bone. He did not look back at the alcove. He stared blankly at the locked iron door at the end of the glass house. "My aunt is arriving by the end of the week, and she is bringing Lady Evelyn." "Lady Evelyn, Your Grace?" Julian crushed the letter completely, his dark eye flashing with a sudden, cornered panic. "My betrothed. They are coming to Ashbourne Manor to chain the beast to a bride." The fragile, desperate sanctuary they had forged in the damp shadows of the glasshouse shattered exactly 3 days later. Clara was seated at her workbench in the eastern quadrant, her good eye fixed upon the intricate, overlapping trichomes of the Selenicerius cutting. The silence of the conservatory, usually broken only by the rhythmic, weeping drip of condensation, was suddenly violently rent apart. It began as a low, ominous rumble vibrating through the iron pillars, followed quickly by the harsh, grating crunch of heavy carriage wheels tearing up the frozen gravel of the main drive. Then came the voices. They were high, shrill, and piercing, echoing off the stone walls of Ashbourne Manor like the cries of exotic predatory birds. Clara's charcoal froze on the vellum. A cold, heavy stone of dread dropped into the pit of her stomach. She stood slowly, her ink-stained fingers gripping the edge of her wooden stool. The heavy iron door at the entrance of the conservatory did not simply open, it was thrown wide with a jarring, rusted screech. Instantly, the thick, earthy atmosphere of the glasshouse was invaded. A cloying, overwhelmingly artificial wave of expensive French perfume. Heavy civet musk, synthetic violet powder, and a tar of roses rolled down the mossy paths, aggressively battling the natural, spicy scent of the jasmine and the wet loam. It coated the back of Clara's throat, making her want to gag. "Good heavens! It is like walking into a boiling kettle," a woman's voice complained, the tone dripping with lazy, aristocratic disdain. "Julian, darling, why on earth do you keep this dreadful swamp?" Clara retreated deeper into the shadows of the towering tree ferns, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm. Through the weeping branches, she saw them. The Dowager Duchess was a formidable woman, draped in heavy black bombazine, but Clara barely noticed her. Her gaze was entirely arrested by the younger woman clinging lightly to her arm. Lady Evelyn, the betrothed. She was a vision of terrifying, flawless perfection. Her hair was a spun gold crown beneath a velvet travelling hat, and her complexion was pristine, unblemished alabaster. She wore a travelling gown of vibrant, shimmering peacock blue silk that rustled with every step she took, a sound so loud and violently unnatural in the quiet glasshouse that it set Clara's teeth on edge. She was everything Clara was not: radiant, wealthy, whole, and perfectly suited for a duke. A sudden, crushing wave of inadequacy washed over Clara. She looked down at her own attire, the faded, threadbare wool of her grey dress, the cuffs frayed from use, her fingers permanently stained with India ink and charcoal dust. The profound, desperate connection she had felt with Julian in the dark alcove suddenly felt like a foolish, feverish delusion. How could a man bound to a creature of such blinding perfection ever truly see a half-blind tradeswoman? Heavy, measured footsteps sounded on the stone path. Julian emerged from the main house to join them. Clara's breath hitched. He was fully armoured. The severe black frock coat was buttoned to his throat. The heavy leather gloves were firmly in place, and the blinding white porcelain mask was strapped rigidly to his face. And he looked massive, terrifying, and completely unapproachable. But Clara, who had traced the ruined flesh beneath that porcelain, could see the minute, agonizing details of his suffocation. His broad shoulders were locked in a posture of violent, barely contained tension. The muscle in his unmasked jaw fluttered erratically, and his right hand was curled into a fist so tight the leather groaned. He was a wild thing, shoved brutally back into a cage. "It is a botanical research facility, Evelyn," Julian replied. His voice was deadened, a flat, echoing baritone completely devoid of the rumbling warmth she knew he possessed. "It is not meant for entertainment?" "Well, it is hideously oppressive." Evelyn sighed, waving a delicate, lace-gloved hand in front of her perfect nose. She released the dowager and stepped further down the path, her silk skirts dragging arrogantly over the delicate moss. "And where do you hide in here, Julian? You spend all your hours in this dirt." Julian's singular dark eye flicked rapidly over the foliage, terrified. He was looking for Clara. He was trying to track where she was hidden, desperate to keep the two worlds from colliding. But Evelyn was already moving, walking with the entitlement of a woman who already owned the estate. She wandered away from the main path, pushing through a curtain of hanging vines, and stepped directly into the eastern quadrant. She stopped, her perfectly sculpted brow furrowing in distaste. Clara stood frozen beside her workbench, feeling entirely exposed in the weak, dappled light. The contrast between them was agonizing, the brilliant peacock silk against the drab, ink-stained wool. Evelyn looked Clara up and down, her blue eyes cold and sharp, sweeping over Clara's face, pausing for a fraction of a second on the slight, unnatural grey cloudiness in Clara's right eye. The aristocrat's upper lip curled in an unmistakable sneer of revulsion. "Julian," Evelyn called out, her voice a mocking bell-like chime. "It seems you have an infestation in your greenhouse. What is this dreary little creature?" Julian stepped into the clearing behind her. He did not look at Evelyn. His dark, agonized eye locked instantly onto Clara. The sheer, helpless fury radiating from him was a palpable heat in the room. "Miss Vance is a botanical illustrator, Evelyn. She is completing a commission for me. She is not to be disturbed." "An illustrator?" Evelyn laughed, a shrill, brittle sound. She stepped closer to Clara's workbench, the overwhelming stench of her violet perfume making Clara physically dizzy. "How quaint. I suppose even the lower classes must find ways to busy their hands." Clara bowed her head slightly, forcing her hands to unclench at her sides. "My lady?" she murmured, the formal address tasting like ash. The jealousy in Clara's chest twisted into a sharp, physical ache. Evelyn ignored the greeting. Her gaze dropped to the workbench, landing on the heavy cream vellum where Clara had spent the last 3 days meticulously rendering the complex, overlapping trichomes of the Selenocereus cutting. Without asking permission, Evelyn reached out with a lace-clad hand and snatched the vellum from the desk. "My lady, please, the ink is not entirely set," Clara began, taking a panicked step forward. "Oh, hush," Evelyn snapped dismissively, holding the delicate paper up to the light by its very edges. She stared at the incredibly detailed, hyper-realistic drawing of the spined cactus stem. The sneer on her flawless face deepened into a look of absolute, mocking disgust. "How utterly dreary," Evelyn proclaimed, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet clearing. "All this effort, all this dirt and heat, for a drawing of an ugly, prickly weed. It lacks any semblance of beauty." Evelyn turned her head to look back at Julian, a cruel, triumphant smile playing on her lips. As she did, she casually, deliberately loosened her grip on the right side of the vellum. She allowed the heavy paper to tilt dangerously downward, directly over the open, rimless glass pot of jet-black India ink resting on the edge of the workbench. "Perhaps," Evelyn purred, her fingers opening a fraction more, "it would look better with a bit of colour." The heavy cream vellum slipped from Evelyn's lace-clad fingers, plummeting directly toward the open, rimless pot of jet-black India ink. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the ruin of 3 days of agonizing labor. But the splash never came. A violent rush of displaced air swept over Clara's face. When she opened her good eye, Julian's massive, leather-clad hand was suspended mere millimeters above the ink pot. He had caught the vellum between his thumb and forefinger with a terrifying predatory speed that defied his massive size. The silence in the clearing was sudden and absolute, ringing in Clara's ears. Julian did not look at his betrothed. His dark eye remained fixed on the delicate paper he had just saved. "You will leave this glass house. Evelyn," he commanded. He did not yell. His voice was a deadly, vibrating whisper that seemed to shake the very condensation from the leaves above them. "You will return to the manor, and you will not step foot within these walls again. Ever." Evelyn's flawless face flushed an ugly, mottled crimson. She opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer, lethal stillness radiating from the beast of Ashbourne silenced her. With a furious, dramatic rustle of peacock blue silk, she turned and stormed out, the dowager trailing anxiously behind her. Julian carefully placed the drawing back onto the workbench. He lingered for a fraction of a second, his gloved fingertips brushing the edge of the paper near Clara's hand, before he turned and followed them back to the manor, sealing the iron door behind him. He had chosen his duty. Hours bled away. Midnight descended over the Yorkshire moors, bringing with it a deep, creeping cold that pressed against the exterior of the glass panes. Inside, the conservatory remained stiflingly humid, but to Clara, it felt entirely hollow. Faint, mocking strains of a string quartet bled through the thick stone walls from the main house. They were hosting a formal dinner to celebrate the impending nuptials. Every note of the waltz felt like a physical twist of a knife in Clara's chest. She sat at her dark workbench, packing her fine-tipped pens and charcoal into her leather satchel. She could not stay. To remain and draw his flowers, while he bound himself to a woman who looked at him with such revulsion, it would destroy her completely. Her vision was failing, but her heart was already breaking. She reached for the heavy brass clasp of her satchel when the air in the glasshouse abruptly shifted. It was subtle at first. A faint, sharp note cutting through the heavy, cloying perfume of the damp earth and jasmine. Clara paused. She took a slow breath. The scent grew stronger, rolling down the western aisle like a physical tide. It was intoxicating and entirely foreign, a rich, heady blend of crushed cloves, warm cinnamon, and a deep, sweet musk that made her pulse instantly accelerate. The Noctis rosa. Drawn by an invisible magnetic pull, Clara left her satchel on the desk. She followed the scent, moving silently over the spongy moss. It led her past the towering ferns, past the weeping willows, directly to the northern wall. The heavy, forbidden iron door, secured by the brass padlock since her arrival, now stood slightly ajar. Clara slipped through the narrow opening. She found herself in a smaller, circular chamber built of entirely clear glass. The storm clouds had broken, and a full, brilliant moon hung directly overhead, flooding the chamber with pure, pooling silver light. In the centre of the room, upon a raised stone pedestal, rested a tangled mass of thorny vines, and blooming at its apex, bathed in the moonlight, was the flower. It was the size of a dinner plate, its petals so impossibly thin they were entirely translucent, glowing with an ethereal, pearlescent inner light. The spicy, intoxicating perfume pouring from its recessed core was dizzying, but Clara's breath caught in her throat, not because of the flower, but because of the man standing beside it. Julian had abandoned the dinner party. He was clad in severe evening wear, a black swallowtail coat and crisp white trousers, but his cravat had been torn away, his collar unbuttoned, and his raven hair was dishevelled. The white porcelain mask was gone, discarded carelessly onto the damp stone floor. He was completely, beautifully exposed in the silver light. He looked up as she entered, his mismatched gaze locking onto hers. The heavy, charged silence between them was thick enough to drown in. "You did not stay at the banquet," Clara whispered, stepping slowly toward the pedestal, mesmerized by the raw, unguarded desperation in his eyes. "They are drinking to a ghost," Julian rasped, his voice rough, vibrating with a profound, breaking restraint. "They are toasting a man who died in a fire 5 years ago. I could not sit there, while the only person who has ever truly seen me was out here in the dark." He closed the distance between them, stepping into her space until the heat of his massive body enveloped her. The spicy scent of the blooming rose mixed with his natural sandalwood, a dizzying, intoxicating combination. Julian reached out. His bare, scarred hand, the hand that had saved her life, trembled violently as he cupped her jaw. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, resting just beneath her failing right eye. "I cannot let you leave, Clara," he breathed, the confession tearing from his throat like a physical wound. "Let the moors freeze. Let the society papers write their damn rumours. I belong in the glasshouse, but only if you are in it with me." Clara leaned her face into his ruined, blistering palm, a single, hot tear slipping down her cheek to wet his thumb. The crushing weight of her inadequacy vanished. In the silver moonlight, beneath the canopy of his monstrous sanctuary, she realized they were two halves of the same wounded soul. "Julian," she whispered, rising onto her toes, the word a surrender. He leaned down, his eyes fluttering shut, his lips a breath away from hers, the ultimate, agonizing culmination of their slow burn. Clang! The heavy iron door was thrown violently backward, striking the stone wall with a deafening, metallic crash. A flood of harsh, yellow lantern light violently pierced the silver sanctity of the hidden chamber. Clara gasped, shrinking back, but Julian's arms snapped around her waist like an iron band, anchoring her flush against his side. Standing in the doorway, flanked by the Dowager Duchess, Mr. Hodges, and a dozen stunned, finely dressed dinner guests holding lanterns, was Lady Evelyn. Evelyn's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Her gaze locked onto Julian's unmasked, scarred face, and a sharp, involuntary shriek of revulsion ripped from her throat. Then, Her wide, panicked eyes darted to the firm, protective grip Julian held on Clara's waist. "Julian!" Evelyn shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the glass. "What is the meaning of this? Step away from that wretched, ruined creature instantly." Julian did not flinch. He did not reach for his mask. He drew himself up to his full, terrifying height, a towering mountain of a man, his scarred face bathed in the lantern light for all of London high society to see. He looked at Evelyn with absolute freezing contempt, then looked down at Clara, his expression softening into an oath of fierce, unbreakable devotion. He lifted Clara's ink-stained hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles in front of the entire horrified assembly. "The only wretched creature in this room, Evelyn," the Duke of Ashbourne rumbled, his voice echoing with absolute lethal finality, "is you. The wedding is cancelled. Now get out of my home." The scandal of Lady Evelyn's sudden, hysterical departure had swept through the Yorkshire moors like a wildfire. But inside the sprawling iron and glass walls of Ashbourne Manor's conservatory, the outside world simply ceased to matter. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the blooming. The oppressive, terrifying labyrinth that Clara had first entered had fundamentally transformed. Or perhaps it was only her perception of it that had changed. A brilliant, flawless morning sun poured through the vaulted glass ceiling. Mr. Hodges, acting on quiet orders, had spent the last fortnight meticulously scrubbing the decades of grime from the exterior panes. Now, the light did not filter through in weak, dirty shafts. It cascaded down in a warm, golden deluge. It struck the broad, waxy leaves of the tree ferns and turned the lingering droplets of condensation into scattered, blinding diamonds. The air was no longer a suffocating, heavy swamp, but a vibrant, pulsing embrace, a testament to life and growth. Clara sat at her familiar oak workbench in the eastern quadrant. The cloying, overpowering perfume of the jasmine had faded with the turning of the season, replaced entirely by the sharp, metallic tang of fresh India ink, the earthy scent of wet loam, and the lingering, sweet spice of the Noctis rosa. She leaned forward, her left eye squeezed firmly shut. The grey fog in her right eye was still there, a murky, persistent threat at the edge of her vision, but the paralysing terror that had once accompanied it was entirely gone. Tomorrow, they would board a private train bound for London. Julian had secured the most renowned optical surgeon in the Empire, threatening to buy the entire hospital if it guaranteed Clara the care she needed. But today, the impending surgery felt like a distant, manageable chore. Today, there was only the peace of the glass house and the final strokes of her masterpiece. As she reached across the desk to dip her fine sable brush into a pot of crimson wash, a sudden flash of light caught her attention. Resting heavy and cool on her left ring finger was an antique gold band. Set into the centre was a massive, square-cut sapphire, as deep and fathomless as the midnight sky over the moors, flanked by 2 flawless diamonds. The Ashbourne family ring. It was entirely too large for her slender finger, having belonged to a Duchess of far grander proportions, but Julian had placed it there the morning after the banquet, and absolutely refused to let her take it off, even to work. Clara smiled, a soft, secret thing, and returned her brush to the vellum. She was painting the Noctis rosa from memory, and the extensive charcoal sketches she had made during its brief, glorious bloom. The image on the paper was breathtaking. She had captured the ethereal, pearlescent translucence of the petals, the delicate, intricate trap of the toxic trichomes, and the rich, vibrant gradient of the recessed core. It was not merely a botanical illustration. It was a love letter rendered in ink and watercolour. A quiet rustle of fabric sounded from across the path. Clara did not flinch. She did not freeze. The sound brought only a profound, settling warmth to her chest. She lifted her head, turning to look at the low stone bench nestled beneath the weeping willow. Julian was sitting there, bathed entirely in the bright morning sunlight. He was not armoured. The severe, high-collared black frock coats had been banished to the depths of his wardrobe. He wore a simple, crisp white linen shirt, the collar undone, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows to expose the corded muscles and faded silver scars of his forearms. He wore no leather gloves. And, most breathtaking of all, there was no white porcelain mask. In the unforgiving clarity of the morning sun, the ruined left side of his face was completely exposed. The jagged, silvery pink ridges of scar tissue stood out starkly against his jaw and cheek. Yet, as Clara looked at him, she felt no pity, no shock, only an overwhelming, bone-deep reverence. The scars were not a mark of a monster. They were the physical proof of the man who had walked through fire to save the helpless, the man who had stepped out of his own suffocating darkness just to stand in the light with her. Julian was not reading his botanical journals. He was simply watching her. His massive frame was relaxed, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his broad shoulders resting easily against the damp stone wall. His singular, dark eye was fixed upon her face, his expression so incredibly open, so filled with a raw, unhidden adoration that it made Clara's breath catch in her throat. The beast of Ashbourne was gone, leaving only the man who loved her with a quiet, terrifying intensity. "You are straining your eye," Julian murmured, his deep, vibrating baritone rolling across the clearing, soft and impossibly tender. "Let me draw the canvas shades, Clara. The sun is too bright on the vellum." "No," Clara replied softly, laying her sable brush down across the rim of the water pot. She turned on her stool to face him fully. "Leave the light, Julian. I want to see you." Julian's chest hitched beneath the white linen. Even after 3 weeks, the absolute, unflinching acceptance in her gaze seemed to stun him. A slow, incredibly handsome smile touched the unruined side of his mouth, softening the harsh, aristocratic lines of his face. He stood, closing the distance between them with his long, predatory strides. But there was no fear in his approach. He stopped beside her stool, reaching out with his bare, scarred hand. His thick, warm fingers gently cupped her jaw, his thumb brushing a smudge of charcoal dust from her cheekbone. The physical contact sent a familiar, thrilling shiver down Clara's spine. "Is the commission complete, Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble as he looked down at the vibrant, glowing flower on the vellum. "It is," Clara breathed, turning her face slightly to press a kiss into the rough, scarred palm of his hand. She looked up into his dark eye, the tension of the long, terrifying weeks finally dissolving into a deep, abiding peace. "The Noctis Rosa, the flower that does not exist." Julian leaned down, his forehead coming to rest gently against hers. He inhaled deeply, breathing in the scent of her ink and the damp, vibrant earth of their shared sanctuary. "It exists," he whispered, his lips brushing against hers with a heartbreaking gentleness. It just required the right light to finally bloom.